Welcome back to the Demystify Sci Mobcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we are going deep into the dark history of the Italian mafia in America. With us for the conversation is our guide, Louis Ferrante, who has just published Volume 2 of a 3-part series that is a comprehensive history of the mafia from 1860s Sicily all the way through 2005. He is the ideal candidate to tell the story because he actually was part of the mob right when it started to fall apart in the late 80s, early 90s. He went to jail for his role in a bunch of huge heists. He was part of a family that was headed by John Gotti, so he was deep in it in the 90s. Went to jail, came out, a reformed man. He had fallen in love with books and literature and history and began to write. So our conversation with him is going to be broken up into 2 parts. So this is the first of 2 episodes that we're going to release. And in this conversation, we cover who is Louis Ferrante, what happened in his life that led him to end up incarcerated for his involvement with the mafia, and how is the mafia involved with the Kennedy family. The second conversation is where we really get into the meat of what Volume 2 of the Borgata trilogy is all about, which is this unholy trinity of influences between the CIA, a group of highly trained Cuban exiles, and the mafia that all want to get rid of Kennedy. And Ferrante has done an enormous amount of research to shed some new light on the story. There are documents that are supposed to be coming out through new disclosure promises, which we'll see promises have been made in the past. Ferrante is kind of skeptical that there's going to be anything in that trove of documents that isn't so redacted or shredded at this point that it's going to shed any light on the story. But we've done economics conversations on the podcast, and if we're trying to understand how the economy works, I think you can't just look at everything that's happening that's above board. You actually have to dive into this deep underbelly of society where the shadow world operates, because the things that we see on the surface are just the tip of the iceberg. And it's a fascinating conversation. So this is part 1. We're going to drop part 2 later this week, so keep an eye out for that. Let us know what you think in the comments.
As always, remember, the podcast is entirely supported by listeners like you. That means we work directly for you. We don't have any sponsors. We're not putting any ads in the middle of all of this to distract you. But that means that you have to support us directly. Please come over and check out patreon.com/demystifysci. You can give as little as $1 a month. You can give us a wheelbarrow full of money if you have it. All of that's going to go towards making sure that we can put more and more time and effort towards this project. And in return, we give you the episodes early, and we invite you to come hang out with us face-to-face once a week every Sunday morning, where we can chop it up about all of our favorite theories of the universe and really steer the ship towards what comes next. Also, you should mark your calendars for June 12th to 16th this summer, where we're going to be coming together in Sesimbra, Portugal, and we're going to bring together some of the best minds in cosmology to discuss what comes next. Because if you haven't noticed, the Big Bang is on the ropes. And if you're somebody who follows that kind of thing, you do not want to miss this historic conference. So check out the details. They're linked up here. Finally, we have one more really incredible announcement, which is our new segment that we're starting at the podcast called Paradigm Drift. Paradigm Drift is going to be your chance as a random audience member to present your theory of anything in the universe and how it works. Except you're only going to have about a minute to do that, and then Nasti and I are going to talk to you for a little bit. Along with our random panelists. This time we have one of our best friends in the whole world, Doug Lee, who's a civil engineer down in San Francisco. And yeah, we'll take a look at your ideas and hopefully find a way to help you present them better in the future. Maybe you'll blow our socks off and you'll win a t-shirt or something cool like that. But it's going to be absolutely amazing. So that is scheduled to be recorded on February 20th. That's a Thursday at 6:30 Pacific time. You're welcome to attend and hang out in the Zoom meeting, or you can sign up for a chance to have your name drawn out of a hat and present your theory on the show. So check it out. All that information is linked up here. And with that, I invite you to sit back, learn about Lou, learn about the mob, learn about how our country's been working for the past 100 years. And next time, we'll check out the Kennedy assassination.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci Podcast.
Learn to see in the dark. Man, I'm loving your book. I've been completely absorbed in it for the last 15, 16 hours. It's
That's great.
I'm yeah, I'm super stoked to talk about it. I unfortunately did not make it to the Bobby Kennedy assassination yet, but
Okay.
I've made it through all of the rest, and
Okay, great.
it's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, you'll know the questions that you'll want to ask anyway, so we could cover it either way. That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to talk about this. I don't we don't have like a list of questions or anything, but it might be cool before we get too deep into that to introduce you to people and kind of I don't know how much you're comfortable with talking about, but it'd be cool to figure out exactly what your life has looked like as an arc that led you up to, look at you. You got this library that you're living in now, and you're obviously you've been a prolific author, and we'll get to your books and so forth in a second. But who is Lou Ferrante?
Huh. I wish I knew. The old Lou Ferrante, so there's at least two, and I'll say that because the old life is a completely different person. So there's at least two people that have existed within this skin, I guess, in one lifetime. I read somewhere how every cell in your body regenerates over the course of time and stuff. So you do change, so. But the old me, I guess there's three. So the child that grew up and was very sensitive, by the way, too. If somebody was handicapped at the time, I'm not sure what the correct term for it is now, but if someone was missing an arm or a leg, I was distraught. I went home and I was sad, and my mother would try to explain to me, it's sad. Please, I understand that, but you can't go through life like that. And she would try to give me as best she could a life lesson. And
where were you growing up, Lou?
Queens, New York.
Oh, nice. We lived in Queens for a while.
Oh, cool. Where about?
Woodside. Off the 7 train. Yeah.
Donovan's Pub.
Yeah, actually, right nearby.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, it was awesome. So I'm growing up, and at some point, I did stick up for kids if they were being harassed and stuff. And I was a small guy myself, but it bothered me if somebody. They used to play this game called Salugi, where they'd pull a kid's hat off and then throw it around the schoolyard, and the guy would be running around trying to get his hat back. And if it came towards me, I'd just hand it back to him, and then everybody would like boo me because I wasn't part of the, So
we called that monkey in the middle where I came from in Ohio.
Right. Yeah,
same game.
I guess pretty much. Yeah, pretty much the same game. So eventually, I hardened, and at some point, I was confused, didn't understand life, and I started to go down the wrong side of the tracks. And me and my friends, a few guys started stealing cars and going for a joyride, and then you'd finish and then just go home and say hello to your mother and father. And we might have came from slightly dysfunctional homes, but whose isn't? I mean, everybody comes from homes that have issues. It's humanity. But for the most part, it was a loving home. And my friends, I was in and out of their houses too, and they came from, for the most part, loving homes. As broken as they were, it's not like we were beaten, abused, hit with 2x4s. Our hands were burnt on the stove. I lived with people like that in prison who went through those things. So I did understand that people do suffer like that early on, and we didn't have those issues, but we were just wild. And but something was wrong. Obviously, I look back later when I was walking around in a penitentiary, not to jump too far ahead, with these high stone walls and gun towers. You do begin to question, yeah, how the hell did I land here? And first it's a lot of people in jail, and this is a major jump because just to give you in a nutshell, so I went from stealing cars to chopping cars, and selling the parts to auto body collision shops, and then hijacking trucks, and then selling the loads to guys on the street, and then eventually getting in with the mob, and eventually I worked my way up. I was answering directly to the heads of my family. I mean, I was around the biggest guys who ran New York and for the most part the country for quite some time. And then I faced the rest of my life in prison at some point. I had this crew of guys that were under me. So although I was low on the sort of totem pole in terms of mafia hierarchy, I was only in my early 20s, but I had a strong crew that I headed. I was the head of that crew, and those guys were in their 30s, 40s, 50s. And the guys who I fenced goods to were in their 60s, 70s. So everyone around me was always older. So I grew up really fast in a lot of ways, but my growth was also stunted in so many ways because it's a naive, ignorant lifestyle, and you're not really enlightened as to how bad this sort of like trajectory you're on. So
Can I ask you a question really quick? When you say it's bad, do you mean that it's the risk is too high for the reward that you get? Like it's an unstable trajectory, or what is bad? Like obviously taking people's possessions from them is unfortunate for those people. Is it just comes with all of the emotional baggage of harming people, or what's bad? What was bad to you?
yeah, bad is the it's a bad way of life. So that I could see what a good way of life is and a bad way of life now, very clearly. And there are legitimate ways of life that are bad ways of life. I feel, I know people in the legitimate world who con people every day in business, and to me, that's a bad way of life. Mine was a bad way of life in the sense that there were, as much as we try not to think there were victims, there are victims. So you're victimizing people. You're also you're creating an overabundance of horrible karma that will eventually catch up with you. So it's bad for others. It's bad for you. It's bad for everyone in your sphere. So it's just like bad all around. I guess I just used like a blanket word, but it is. And there's good ways of life where you try to lead your life. Um, I'm not a great businessman because you have to haggle with people, you have to con people, you have to keep secrets, and there's all kinds of stuff. I just like writing a book, put it out there. You want to read it, you read it. You don't, you don't. I prefer that. I don't want to ever go back to, that type of life where, you're involved with trying to dupe people or hurt people, or where you walk away. It's competitive. You're the victor. That person loses, and it's a Darwinian world. I'm very familiar with that. Obviously, we all compete, you know, as much as we possibly are willing to compete. But it's a competitive world in so many different ways. But as an author, I think I get to check out for the most part, as far as that's concerned, and I try to live a good life as best I can. So I end up in the penitentiary. I'm facing the rest of my life in prison. They charge me with heading this crew of armed robbers who do heists and hijackings, and we were real. We were like you see on TV. I mean, we were accused of doing armored car robberies, armored car depots, um, hijacking trucks. The baddest movies you've seen. That was us. That was what we were.
What year was this, by the way, or approximately?
Yeah. So I started. They the FBI started investigating me in 1993, and what happened was one of the fences that I used a lot was caught, and he was an older man, probably in his mid 60s, and he went sour, decided to turn state's evidence, and he made sort of a deal with the feds where he would give up people but not become. He didn't want to be known as a snitch. He wanted to try to hide what he was doing, so he agreed to give information to the federal government in return for a lighter sentence or no sentence. And he started to shovel as much information from all the decades he had been on the street. And I was the primary guy that brought him goods. So for years, I was hijacking trucks, I was doing heists, and he was my main fence. He was from the 47th Street Jewelry District. And
So like a fencer, sorry, I'm such a ignorant suburban kid. So a fencer is somebody who buys the goods that you're jacking, basically.
A fence.
A
Not
fence.
I think a fencer is somebody. I don't know if that's somebody who does fencing. Like
I'm sorry, man. I'm sorry.
it sounds
A
like
fence. Okay.
yeah, yeah. So it's a fence, but he fences goods. Basically, you go to him, and let's say, for example, I steal at that time, let's say a truckload of VHS recorders. For argument's sake, that's something like ancient history to like a millennial now. Like, what's a VHS recorder? It's like when we grew up, we couldn't probably imagine what the heck an 8-track cassette recorder was. But it was like, I would go to him and say, look, I got $100,000 worth of these. What can you give me? And he would try to figure out what he could give me. And I would get so many cents on a dollar. And I would just drop the truck off. And then he would know. He had a network of people that he dealt with. So he would know who could move those goods. And by the way, I'm older than you guys, but I'm aware of that when I said the 8-track cassette. That might be ancient history to you guys too.
Yeah, I never saw one in action.
I've never even heard of it probably. But
so do those goods end up in legitimate retail shops, or are they being sold?
Yes, in many cases. So sometimes it's sold as quote unquote swag, where the goods are sold on the street to different people. But if you have a big load, we knew people who owned different chain stores that dealt with closeouts. So those people, through my fence, obviously he knew them, but those people would take then an abundance of goods and distribute them amongst their, basically closeout stores where they, there are a few chain stores that are closeout stores now in the United States that we didn't deal with, but they are identical to the places that we would move goods. Because if they took a truck from us or a truck from somebody else, I mean, unless the FBI is onto them and has a reason to go check the store, they usually move the goods fast at a really quick discount price and they're gone. The FBI is not going to go knocking on each person's door to try to find a piece of electronic equipment. So they will attempt to eventually go to the places if they get a tip, and that's what my fence did. He gave up everybody, including me. And as I understand it, the FBI was dumbfounded because they were looking at a lot of seasoned older mobsters for the things that I was accused of from that moment on. So I went to prison. I hired and fired some of the best attorneys money could buy. And I was eventually able to duck a life sentence, and I got a 13-year sentence on a plea. I hired the famed civil rights attorney, William Kunstler, and I became very close friends with him.
I was going to ask you, like, before we get to the conviction and you inevitably clearing your name and getting out of jail, like in the mob worlds and in the criminal underground, so the fence is collecting the stolen goods. Is everybody who's downstream of the fence aware that they're stolen, or is it kind of he presents as a legitimate businessman who just has excellent deals?
Yeah, both, depending on how he approaches it. So it might be something where for example, if we had, let's say, a dozen mink coats from the garment industry, from the garment center, and somebody stole maybe a rack of mink coats right off the street and, said, hey, Luke, you do me a favor and, who could move these? And I said, sure, no problem. I'll get rid of them. Or maybe someone in my crew did it. I would contact my fence or we might even just give them to friends. Here, this is for your girlfriend or your wife or your mother. But if we were going to sell them, we might sell them to people we know. So they're aware, we're aware. So that might happen a lot. But there's also times where if it's a tractor trailer full of merchandise and it goes to some type of closeout retail store, then the person who's involved, the person who owns that chain of stores, he's aware, but the retail customer obviously has no idea. She has no idea they're buying a piece of stolen merchandise. And they're really not culpable. I mean, they can't be incriminated by it either. The store owner can, I can, my fence can, but the poor customer just walked into a store and bought a piece of electronic equipment or what have you. So it could go either way. It depends. It depends, like, if it's too much for us to get rid of on the street, then we had to go to a fence who had to go to one of people in his network. And he had that network that he built up over decades. I'm only in my early 20s to mid 20s at the time. So, I mean, I know him and he knows everyone. So through him, I'm able to pretty much move anything, which was really great for me. And he trusted me to the extent that if I told him what I had, before I even delivered it, he paid me at times. He would take the money and pay me himself. He would say, "This is what I could offer you on $1." If I settled for it, he'd hand me the money right there. So it was a really, really good deal. I called him my uncle at the time. I called him, in my memoir, I refer to him as I think I referred to him as Uncle Jimmy, but his real name was Uncle Billy. And I used to call him Uncle Billy. I used to give him a hug and a kiss when I saw him. He had a beautiful, massive apartment overlooking Times Square. He was a wealthy guy. He had been on the streets his whole life. It was back in the day when you could become extremely wealthy and have a long run without encountering the law. That changed during his later years when he got pinched, and my early years when I got investigated because of him and eventually got pinched. So it was sort of like a monumental change in the way the streets ran, because the FBI was cracking down on us, anybody who was mafia connected or mob connected, um, relentlessly. And in the early to late 90s, that's when they really, really drove hard against the mafia. Late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s.
Was that just new leadership situation, or
Um, there was
it's
a number of reasons. One was John Gotti was the boss of the family I was um, with, which was the Gambino crime family, and John Gotti was a very showy mafia don, very showy boss. We wouldn't say I'm mafia don, but for your listeners and viewers, he was a very showy guy, and he took over the family through a violent coup, where he killed the former head and the former boss and underboss of the family, and it was in Midtown Manhattan on the streets, with 100 public witnesses. The FBI could not allow that to happen. I mean, it's public safety. Where old bosses, if they did a coup, they might have shot somebody in the back of an Italian restaurant like Lilo Galante, or they killed somebody and wrapped them up in a rug and dumped them somewhere. But it was more covert, more, um, it wasn't in your face. And that the way John Gotti took over, it was in your face. And then he continued to thumb his nose at them by dressing really, really super fashionable and loving all the media attention that he got. He wouldn't talk to the media because it wasn't allowed. But you could see that he ate it up and he became a famous person. He was on the cover of newspapers all the time. And by association, because I hung around with the Gottis, all his family, his nephews were my friends, his brothers were my friends. So through association, I became pretty big in my own world, and I loved that. Again, nothing fills an empty head like you know, power, um, some type of you feel like when you're young, especially, and you're confused, and you feel like the world is a very, very hard place to succeed in. And we all go through it, even if you go to college and you're trying to figure out what your career is going to be like, and then maybe you enter the workforce and you're confronted with millions of people that you feel like they seem to be pushing you down. They won't let you get ahead. So we all experience that in every sort of, I don't care what you choose in life. Whether you go to school or you don't go to school, you're going to go to school. So it's going to happen, and you're going to live life. And so I felt like that. Obviously, as a kid, I didn't know my direction. I felt like life was hard. People told me, "Don't open a business; you'll fail." 99% of businesses fail. It's very hard. Um, no one's leading me by the hand. Go to college. Okay, who's going to pay for it? Go pay for it yourself. Where I don't even know how to sign up for college. And it wasn't something I wanted to do anyway by then. I was robbing cars, I had a chop shop and hijacking trucks. But, I mean, you need somebody to mentor you. You may not have that. So there's a lot of things that go into it.
Was it exciting, by the way? Like, did you enjoy the sport of it? Like, hijacking trucks is it terrifying? Like,
I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved
For
it.
Right
like
from
a
the
20-year-old kid, it just seems like that's like playing football or something, basically.
I loved it. I've skydived, and skydiving's nothing. Skydiving's nothing like hijacking a truck.
Did you feel that way right from the very beginning? I was going to ask, like, the very first time that you hijacked a car, like, what did that feel like?
First time was hard. The guy who this is an interesting story. So it's a really good question. Um, I felt like you had to control your you got a lot of anxiety going into it. You need to control it. You need to do this. You want to do it. You want the money. You want the outcome. You want to. This is what you're doing. I've already chosen to be a criminal. Once you once you cross the line in the stand, too, it's hard to cross the first line in the stand with different things, but we tend to sprint. I wrote that in the latest volume when I was discussing something else about someone else. You tend to sprint after you cross the line in the sand. So crossing it was hard the first time, and then you sprint after that. It's like easy. It's exciting. It's fun. But the first time we hijacked the truck, me and my friends, I got on the truck. I took the guy and then I waved my friends to get on the truck with me. I waved to them and they came on. And then we drove the truck and we were really nice to the guy. We told him, look, I'm sorry I had to do that to you. Is there anything in this truck you need? And it was like a big box truck with like $100,000 worth of merchandise on it. But it was a big, giant box truck so that you could walk up and down the aisle up to the front. And he said, sure. He goes, if you could get and one of my other friends now is driving. And he goes, if you could get my family pictures, they're in the visor. Please put them in my pocket. His daughter, his wife. And then he goes also to there's like a sheet with like a manifest sheet or whatever, like that he has the goods that are on that truck he needs after the insurance, he told us. So I took the clipboard and I put it under his arm, and we put a cushion under his ass and basically asked him if there's anything else he needs. Is he thirsty? We'll stop and get him a drink. And at some point or another, now I just want to make this ultra clear because it sounds like I'm Saint Francis of Assisi. We're robbing a truck, and I know what we're doing. We're not doing a nice thing. We're doing a horrible thing. It's horrible, and I regret it. But having said that, we weren't vicious people. We definitely didn't want to hurt the person. We just wanted the goods on the truck. And also, too, if somebody owned something, we took a truck thinking that it's a corporation. Who cares? It's a big company. It's not his money. But I would never rob something that belonged to someone. So, for example, the guy, goes out every day on his own little truck and he fills up like vending machines with his little potato chips or something. And I don't care if you couldn't give me $1 trillion to rob that from that guy because I would felt like that's his little livelihood. Whereas a truck is insured, you work for a company. I felt then the hell with them. But I do realize that I was traumatizing somebody. I guess I didn't realize it, but to the extent that I knew I should try to make his trauma as palatable as possible. And my friends were the same way. So we're driving, and at some point or another, we're going to the drop off to get rid of the truck. And at some point, he goes, and I wrote about this in the opening chapter of my memoir. He said, you seem like nice guys. He said, you bunch of young, nice guys. He said, you ever think this stuff will catch up with you? And it was a brilliant statement, and it just went right over my head because how could you ever imagine it might catch up with you if this is the first time you did it? I'm just starting. And then many, many years later, when I sat in a penitentiary where in Lewisburg Penitentiary, it was hell. Inmates killed each other with prison-made machetes. My very first day in the population, the Aryan Brotherhood literally hacked to death and gutted 2 black Muslim inmates with prison-made machetes. That's like welcome to the penitentiary. And you have to wonder, how did I get here? And I thought back through my life and I realized that gentleman that day had pretty much prophesized what would happen to me at some point. It will catch up to you, but I couldn't see that. He probably had enough life experience to know that we were headed for a wall, but you would never have been able to explain that to us at that time.
Did you know anybody from that time that never did get caught? Like, are there people that just kind of did manage to skate through and go past the wall?
I'll say no. There's a yes with a catch. So I know a lot of people who have died, been killed, some accidentally in the midst of doing something, some murdered. I know a lot of people who've gone to jail for a lot of time or the rest of their lives. So that's all the sad stories. Anybody who kind of seems to have gotten away with it, I know because I know the law. I studied law when I was in prison all those years, and I helped a lot of people get out of jail once I studied law. I know that the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, they have a handle on what's going on in this country. and they have informants all over the place. And if you've been just sort of skating through the world, very, very like gracefully, it's because you're probably giving information and you're some type of informant, and they've allowed you to stay on the street. I know that wholeheartedly. I don't believe anybody who seems to have gotten away with it has really gotten away with it, because it's not what you do. If I decide I'm going to be a heist guy on my own and not tell anyone, I'm going to be the Pink Panther, and I'm going to come climb to the roof and cascade down with this wire, steal the gems and get out of there. If I never tell anybody, I probably could get away with it for a long time, maybe forever. The problem is you have to deal with other people and you network, and the criminal element aren't rocket scientists. Eventually someone's going to talk on a taped phone, someone's going to get in trouble for something else, and someone's going to try to get out of that trouble and give up whoever they know. And it's just a excuse me, it's a chain of events that's inevitable and inescapable. So for example, I have a dear friend I met while I was in prison, and he's a great guy. He got way more time than he deserved as a young man. He dealt drugs, and in the midst of dealing drugs, a friend of his got caught, a childhood friend. That childhood friend testified against him, or gave information against him, I should say. When he did that, my friend found out about it, went to his house, knocked on the door. The friend answered the door. He punched him in the face and said, "I can't believe you ratted me out. We know each other since we're children." Punched him in the face and went home. Obviously, if the guy already squealed on him, he's only going to squeal on that too. So it's not a brilliant move to punch him in the face. So obviously the guy called up the federal agents who he was talking to already and said, "I was just assaulted in my living room." Basically I opened the door, he punched me in the face and went home. Well, when they charge him, the federal government, they not only charge him with the amount of drugs he was dealing, but they also charge him with violence and assault on a witness, and they upward depart from the ordinary guidelines, which are astronomical already. And he gets like 35 years. And he's a young man. He's in his early 20s, and he's going to have to do 35 years now. And you're going to do that time. It's not like, oh, I got 35 years, but I'm sure someone will just pardon me one day, or I'll get out. No, you're going to do 35 years. If you're a young man, he was behind the eight ball to begin with. He was half black, half Greek, and he came from a neighborhood where, they really didn't have a lot of patience for black drug dealers. And so you're going to do that 35 years. So he's away, and I meet him. He's a great guy, and I listened to his case, and I said, well, this is despicable, because if you're in the mob like I was, we don't punch you in the face if you're ratting on us. We do something a lot more harmful and maybe something permanent. So that's serious. And judges should know that. And the FBI should know that. Him punching someone in the face only showed his how juvenile he was. And you don't give him 35 years for punching his childhood friend in the face. You just should see it as, gee, you must be real young and stupid to think that was going to solve your problem. You only made it worse. Even if you want to upward depart and give him another year or two for the punch, because I'm not going to say it should go unpunished. Okay, that's fine. There should be some type of punishment, but make it commensurate with what he did. And they gave him 35 years, so he's away all this time. He changes his life. He feels like a different man when I'm with him. And he studies law. He's absolutely brilliant, a legal eagle. Helps a lot of people, taught me a lot of what I knew about the law. And I became an expert myself, but from the seeds that he planted, because he was really, really brilliant like that and intuitively. And there's no lawyer you could ever find, by the way. I hired and fired 7 of the best attorneys money could buy, including William Kunstler. William Kunstler was a legend. I'm in a biography about Kunstler somewhere, but he was a legend. He rode the buses with Martin Luther King. He defended Malcolm X. He went in to negotiate with the prisoners during the Attica riots to get the guards released. He was a legend, and he became my friend. And he may be the one lawyer I would say, if he applied himself to my case, it's difficult to say I'm better than him. But I went through other attorneys that I knew way more about the law than them, and they were high-paid attorneys. But legal eagles in jail, because they wear the uniform and you live behind bars, you just tend to understand the law a lot better because you're suffering at the hands of the law. And no judge will ever understand that. Let a judge take his robe off and put a jumpsuit on for a week before he gets on that bench, and he'll be a different judge for the rest of his life, he or she. I mean, that's just the way it is, and it should be, I feel. But having said that, I leave prison at some point. I reverse one of my cases from prison on a technicality. I wasn't innocent. I was guilty of the things I did. And I got out in 8.5 years, very luckily. In that time, I educated myself. I picked up my first book. I fell in love with reading. I fell in love with books. I taught myself how to write. And how I taught myself how to write was basically, I don't have a writing teacher in jail, obviously. There's no universities in prison that you could sign up for writing classes and stuff. But I came to the realization that I fell in love with like 19th century fiction at one point. And I fell in love with like the Bronte sisters, um, Thomas Wolfe. Thomas Wolfe, I'm sorry, he was 1926. He died, an American author who I love too, by the way. Gustave Flaubert, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, um, George Eliot. I fell in love with all of these like masters and mistresses of 19th century fiction. And I realized that everything that like Alexander Dumas knows about writing is in The Count of Monte Cristo. You just need to read it and sort of like be cognizant of how he starts and ends a chapter, how he introduces a character. Everything that Tolstoy knows about writing is in Anna Karenina. And if I read Anna Karenina, I wouldn't just read it like lightly. I would read it to see how he's developing her as a character, how he exits a character, enters a character, how he gets rid of a character, how he builds the plot. And I would take notes in the margin. And every great author became my writing teacher, which was incredible. And now I'm going, my gosh, I have the greatest writing teachers money could ever buy, and they're literally free. And I felt like the universe was working in my favor, because talking about Anna Karenina, and I wrote about this in my memoir. I had just finished War and Peace, and I'm like, wow, I would love to read something else by him. That's incredible. And I literally go to the bathroom, and there's a broken urinal next to me that's been like out of not working for like I don't know how many months, and somebody tossed a coverless copy of Anna Karenina in the urinal. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to wash this off. It's jail. It's not like, there's different rules when you're on the street. You never take something out of a urinal. Okay. But it's jail. Where am I getting Anna Karenina? I don't have Barnes and Noble in here. So I grab it. I read it. So a lot of things came my way. Like the more I was working off my bad karma, and I felt like I was paying for everything I did. I felt like there was a higher power. I do believe in a God, a higher power. I can't explain to you who God is, but it's sufficient to say that there is a higher power at work in the universe. And I felt like the more that I worked off my bad karma and made strides towards doing good, the more things came to me as if the universe was answering and delivering me things that I needed time and again, which was incredible to feel that. So I felt like the hand of a higher power was punishing me first for things that I had done. That's the first thing. And I tried to impress that upon other convicts when I was helping people with their cases. Everybody just says, I'm innocent. And I would say, no, you're not. I'm not innocent. Neither are you. I'm not the judge. I'm not your jury. If you want me to help you, let's be straight here. You're not innocent. And I think you should get it through your head, because it's a big wake up call when you realize that, because you look at life differently, and then you could start to repair yourself. But anyway, I did help a lot of people. I don't know how many. It was harder to help people realize that what they did was wrong. And a lot of people are victims of circumstances. Let's not discount that. You come from a home that beat you your whole life. A mother and father who beat you your whole life, or you never had a mother and father, and you've been in foster homes and never had a really good foster home where people hugged you and told you they loved you. It's very difficult then to make the proper decisions, to feel love, to experience that. There's so many voids in your life that there is, obviously, I understood that. And I would talk to them and say, I understand there are other circumstances around your life that may be responsible for you ending up here, but you have to take some responsibility yourself if you're going to change. And that was a huge thing I did, I think, was when I said, I have no right to stick a gun in somebody's mouth. Who the hell am I? And I can't convince myself that because it's a corporate truck that's okay. You're still traumatizing a person for life. How dare you? And I remember I used to have this prayer. I used to say, if there is a God, please hear me. Don't let me out of this place until my bill is paid. I don't want to leave here. I don't mind suffering every day. I do not want to leave here until my bill is paid. And I used to say that all the time. And I felt that way. I knew I had to pay a steep bill. Um, Getting back to my buddy, where I began this was he changed his life around. I felt good about it. He was one of my dear friends. I sent him commissary money for many years after I came home. And he finally gets out after like 20 something years, 22 or 24. He got out after they did that massive prison reform. Something in there helped him and he got out early. And he was out for a couple of years. And I went looking for him one day because we talked regularly. And I'm texting him, he's not answering. Then I try to call, he's not answering, and it went on for like a few weeks before I said, "Let me look him up on the computer. Hopefully he's okay." And I found out he's back in. So after all those years, and he was just a young kid. So I think maybe at that point, maybe he's institutionalized. He had been there in 20 something years, and for whatever reason, he went back. And I haven't talked to him yet. He broke my heart. I felt slightly betrayed because I was there for him all those years. I will get over that at some point. I forgive him already, but it takes a little time. He's going through his case. I'm going through my own issues. I used to send and at times when I came home from prison, it's not like I was floating in money. I'm rebuilding my life. So at times it was my last $100. I would either send him in commissary or send it to his mom and tell his mom, "Hey, go out to dinner." He had a son too that he had before he went to jail, and he never really got to hold him after he was an infant, the kid. So I'd say to the mom, take your grandson out to dinner. I'm sending you some money. And so it hurts that, yeah, I felt betrayed myself as a friend. So I'm dealing with that. I'll get over it. I forgive him already. It's just a question of time before I reach out to him and hopefully figure out what the hell went wrong in his head, because he's such a brilliant guy. Um, he's an absolute genius in so many ways, and he's a kind-hearted person. I was in jail. He was a peacemaker. He was a diplomat. Time and again, he diffused problems between other people who he knew, and a lot of people had a lot of respect for him. And he would jump into the middle of something to diffuse a problem, as did I. But there are a few people who do that. A lot of people cheer it on. You're in Dante's Inferno when you're in jail, and there's a lot of evil people who do not really feel like turning their lives around. And so a lot of times when you do want to turn your life around, you have to keep that to yourself. It's not something you could just parade up and down the tier block and go, "I'm a new man today." Oh, really? Let's stab you and see if let's see how you still bleed. We think you're the same. Let's check that one out. These people are evil. At times I would get books when I was like bookish, at that time. I'm reading a book a day, 18 hours a day, and I'm teaching myself how to write. And I would go to pick up my books from the delivery room, and I'd come back and I had LASIK surgery after I got home from prison, but I used to wear glasses. I never wore glasses before I went to jail because I was too vain. But I needed them. And when I got to jail, I said, "I'm in the yard. I can't even see if somebody's coming at me and people are killing each other. I need glasses." So I took a eye test, and I had friends send in glasses for me. So I'd go get my books. I'd have 5 or 6 books under my arm. I'd have my glasses on. And when I got transferred from the federal prison, where a lot of people knew me because they knew me as a mob guy, I was pretty much okay. But now you're in state prison where nobody knows you. And a lot of times people try to take a shot at me because they figured that I'm this bookish guy, maybe that went to university and made a mistake somewhere, got trapped off and ended up in prison. And I'm an easy target because I got 5 or 6 hardcover books under my arm, the history of this, the biography of whom, and my glasses. And I would literally just take my glasses off and throw them on the floor, toss my books to the floor and say, "Let's do this, MFA. I'll show you who I am." And they would go, "No, no, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you," because they're bullies. So they're looking for easy targets, and then they would back off. And I have to pick my glasses up. And, at times I broke them. I still have the glasses I wore in jail. And the final pair was so damaged so many times that there are paper clips holding the things on the ends. And because the screws fell out. And, but time and again, people will test you. And a lot of times, if you're kind too, like you want to hold the door for somebody in jail, let's say you go to the chow hall, it's normal for me to hold the door for people, even to this day, my whole life. If a lot of people today nowadays don't even say thank you. They don't even smile. They don't recognize you as if you're like the concierge. You're working in their apartment building, which drives me up a wall, but I just don't care. I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. I am doing it for them, but you know what I mean. You just do it and you hope that somebody appreciates it. But in jail, you can't do that. If you go to the chow hall and you hold the door for somebody, they think you're weak because there's no kindness. There's only strength and weakness. So you have to let it slam in their face. And that's contrary to how I was raised. That's contrary to who I am. But I would have to just let it slam in their face and not hold it for them, because if I hold it for them, then they're going to come over to my cell later and say, get me some things off commissary. And I'm going to go, well, I don't get where that came from. Oh, I held the door for him. He must think I'm his servant, like I'm scared of him. And so it's like a lot of ignorant people are there, and you wish you could change all of their minds. And I was able to help a lot of people in a lot of ways. At some point, my cell became like Sigmund Freud's office, where people would come in and I'd take a seat in the chair by the desk, and they'd sit down on lay down, and they'd be on my bunk, and I'd be like going, and then what? And what was your childhood like? I'm doing psychoanalysis like 101 in a penitentiary. So I was able to help a lot of people. I put marriages back together, where I told guys, you're screaming at your wife all the time or your girlfriend. You left her. You kind of like just really abandoned her when you ended up in jail, and you did things that led you here. Did she have anything to do with them? No, she didn't know. Well, then how is it her fault? So a lot of times, maybe you're right. Let me call back and apologize. So a lot of times I was able to help people. But once again, you got to pick and choose who you're able to help, because a lot of just people, it's very far and few that you're able to talk to like that and let them into your world even slightly. So I still have an issue with letting people into my life because of those years. So you got to be very careful, because somebody take you for what they'll call, he's a sucker or a punk, and I could abuse him.
Your story in general is completely fascinating. I do want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about the story as well that you brought to our table that we've been reading.
Okay, so the way that I see it is I see it as being deeply related to your past, right? Because you're not writing about the mob as just somebody who comes from the outside in and decides that this is, a fun research project.
Mm-hmm.
You're writing from the perspective of somebody who was participating in what from the outside seems kind of like the tail end of the mob's ascendancy in America. And so it's almost like a post-mortem. Like you come out the other side and you're like, what the hell happened? Like, what was it that I was a part of? Is that kind of where your interest in the history of the mob lies?
1000% accurate. I couldn't have summed it up better than what you just said. I definitely, I caught it at the tail end. The third volume of the Borgata trilogy is Autumn of Empire, and that is my own time that I experienced. I was privy to the events that happened. I knew the people involved. All the people that I'm writing about, I either had a close personal relationship with, or I was acquainted with them in one way or another. So it's really, really, I was like privy to it's almost like if you, I wrote about it in my first volume of the Borgata trilogy. I wrote when Edward Gibbon sat down overlooking the ruins of Rome and decided to write the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. It was 1700s, and so how many years had passed? Centuries had passed between the end of the Roman Empire and when he picked up the pen. I literally walked out of those rooms and picked up a pen and taught myself how to be a writer. So I think I'm the most equipped person to actually write about it. And there's also there's a lot of other mob guys that float around who either cooperated. They get ghost writers, they have co-authors. Nobody actually took the time and served all that time and taught themselves how to write and reflected on all the different experiences and everything I'd seen. So I think that puts me in a premier spot. And I don't want to sound like free of, I'm refreshingly free of false modesty here, right? But I definitely am the person, I think, to write it, to, having lived it, and I see when I read history, when I go back, because you have to think about it. The biggest mafia don, let's take, for example, John Gotti, who most people know from documentaries or books. He doesn't know the history of the mafia. He knows his own history. He's never sat down in a library and studied what Lucky Luciano said to Albert Anastasia. And he knows the life he's involved in. He's an expert at it, just as I understood it. But if you explain to me, if you asked me a question about the history of the mob when I was in it, I couldn't have told you. So now I go back and I study and I research all the history when I'm gearing up to write this history of my own. And I'm realizing that there are so many stories that have been repeated for decades that are false. And what usually happens, I took a deep dive into it, and I realized that like maybe one journalist or one author kind of speculates at first and says this, last night there was a homicide and this might have been what happened. And the next journalist or author picks it up, or let's say the next author picks it up and cites that as a source for his material. And then the following cites now has two sources, and the next one has three sources. And at some point through this, like, it becomes like sort of like certified through time, and it's been wrong all along. So I was able to go back and I immediately spot, having lived the life, if something's wrong. I'm going, there's no way, Frank Costello would have ever said or did that. I've been around mob bosses like Costello my whole life. And not only was I around them in the street, but now I'm around them 24/7 in a prison cell, where you can't escape them. And you really, really get to really see what people are about when you're in a jail cell with them, prison cell. So it's like, okay, this could have never happened. So I would usually go back, because I don't want to just tell the reader, don't believe this because I'm telling you. That's not right to me. I want people to explain things to me. I don't want people to ever tell me that this is how it is, and you have to believe me because I'm an expert in this field. No, I'd like you to explain it to me. So I do that time and again, where I bring the reader back through time. I show them where the story may have come from, where it may have originated, and then I tell the reader what is the plausible scenario that likely happened here. And I've gotten a lot of great feedback from readers who said nobody's ever done that. And I want to teach the reader how to think like a mobster themselves, so that when he or she picks up another book about the mob, the red light will go off in your head. If something is off, you'll say, no way, I read Lou Ferrante's book, and now I know how to think like a mobster. That would have never happened. There's no way. So I do that time and again, and I may have offended some historians, but for the most part, my readers are really, really happy about that, because I take them through it, and I've proven to them in each scenario why it's definitely wrong. Yeah, it's not.
By the way, were you ever nervous that it would reflect poorly on you, that you're telling these stories about people who might, in some way be on the outside and unhappy with somebody revealing their histories and so forth? Or is it, there's enough historical distance between you and these events that it doesn't matter?
My first, they love my books. They send word to me through different people that they love my books. They read my books in jail. Yeah, but to answer your question more accurately, when I got my first book deal with HarperCollins, they offered me a lot more money to use real names, and I said I can't do that. I'm going to have to use fake names and change identifying facts, because the people are still out there. And at the time, I don't know if the statute of limitations was up on everything. So I insisted that I use fake names and changed identifying facts. Subsequent books I've written, my book Mob Rules, What the Mafia Can Teach the Legitimate Businessman, is an international bestseller translated into 20 languages. So it's done extremely well. It's been recognized. It's made bestseller lists all over the world. And the mob guys that I knew read that book in jail all the time and send word through somebody I know. It's, hey, tell Louis I love that book. And in that book, I have mentioned names, but I'm complimenting them. So I'm not giving them up for crimes. I'm saying, hey, these guys are savvy businessmen. This is what you could learn if you strip away the violence and you take away all the cunning and the deceit and the Machiavellian intrigues, and you just take that all away. these guys know how to do business. And at first, I didn't know it would be so well received. I kind of like, it was like a little tongue in cheeky to me. I'm like, okay, it's cool. My agent said she could sell it, put a book out there. I get to tell some history because I worked in a lot of history where I would do, I would give you an event that happened in the mob. And sometimes I would reinforce it with a very similar event, sometimes identical, that happened throughout history, whether it be the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, or whatever. I'd pluck something from history and say, this is how Thomas Becket dealt with this issue, what have you. This is how Richard III did this. So
that seems to be a really big and fascinating theme that runs through all of your work, which is the parallels between what's happening in the underworld and that which is happening on the surface at every level, like the crumbling line between cartelism, whether it's the government or it's the mob or it's these actors in Renaissance Italy. There's always this parallel that can be drawn, and it's like some acts, governments are notoriously violent. They assassinate people. Like all of the same things we would associate with mob behavior are given legitimacy in the form of states often. And that parallel is just super fascinating. It seems to kind of run through a lot of your stories.
Well, it's interesting too, because I think that you might have mentioned this, but I don't remember if you did. The idea that the state's legitimacy comes from a monopoly on violence. And so we basically, the legitimate businessman operates inside of the protection of the state that promises him that, or her, if they do the right things and they are operating within the law, that the state will come and protect them eventually.
That's exactly correct. A mobster once said to me, he said, there are two organizations. He was a much older mobster. He's dead now. He said, there are two organizations that kill in this country, us and the United States government. That's what he said to me. And it was a really, really powerful statement to a kid. I realized that that's exactly right. And that's why I think the mob, at some point, the government was willing to jump into bed with the mob to kill world leaders. For example, I speak about it at length in volume 2 of the Borgata trilogy, when they're trying to kill Fidel Castro, who overthrew Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. And Castro declared himself as a Marxist Leninist, and he expropriated a lot of different corporate land and machinery and resources in Cuba. So the CIA wanted to kill him, and the mob was thrown out of the casinos in Cuba that they owned and controlled. So they wanted to kill him, and the CIA thought that they could partner with the mob and have the mob kill Castro for them, because those are the two entities that kill in the United States: the United States government and the mafia. At some point or another, I believe that the government felt like they should monopolize that for themselves, and that's when they started to destroy the mafia more aggressively. And that was sort of like towards the Autumn of Empire, which would be my third volume. But yeah, I think that they want a monopoly on that violence. They do not want the mob to have to share that with anybody.
When you were on the inside and prior to getting arrested, did you have a sense that the mob had a mandate, that it was operating with the subtle blessing of the government because they were useful, or had that understanding already fallen apart? Because from what I read in the second book, which was that there was this uneasy alliance, which was weird, right? Because so the book is about the assassination of JFK and RFK. And early on, you talk about the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa and Sinatra and like all of these characters that technically are operating on different sides of the law, right? So like Sinatra and the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa are kind of in the mob world. The Kennedys are obviously in the above board power world. And yet there's all these parallels between them that seems like there's concessions being made that allows them to continue operating. In Vegas, they're working with the CIA doing these Cuban training camps to make sure that the Bay of Pigs goes off correctly. And so by the time that you're in the mob, is there a sense of like a betrayed order? That the government is now coming after people, or like, what does it? Yeah, what's it feel like?
Yeah, yes and no. Great question. When in volume 1 and 2 of the Borgata trilogy, the mafia had infiltrated not only industry in the United States and labor unions, but they also infiltrated the political elite, and they had literally paid for underwritten the campaigns of mayors and governors, congressmen, senators, and they were very, very heavily. They had heavily penetrated that world, and everybody had their hand out. And it began during Prohibition, when the government made a major error and denied the American public alcohol. When they did that, when they made that mistake, the American public was against it. And we live in a democracy, and if people were given a vote, they would have voted against it. They didn't. They did not like it. However, Congress ran away. They had a strong lobby, and they basically persuaded Congress to outlaw alcohol. So the mob kind of like went from these really vicious people who were killing people and leaving people on the street to kind of like romantic saviors, because now they're not only feeding the public its need for alcohol, and the public kind of likes them, but they're opening up speakeasies all over the country, and these speakeasies are where they could go to get the alcohol. And now women who have been sort of like chained to domestic roles for centuries are now able to kind of go to a speakeasy, curse and swear, light up a cigarette or a cigar, have a drink, so they feel liberated. So men and women are now starting to feel like that's when the sort of like romanticism of the mobster started to come around. It started to happen. So now coming out of Prohibition, they knowing there were a lot of people with their hands out, politicians, law enforcement officials who felt like, I don't believe in Alice Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter said, they're all hypocrites. Every one of those politicians who voted against alcohol has a liquor cabinet at home. She famously said, and she thought there was one in the White House. So I think she said there was one in the White House. So they were hypocrites. So the public knows this. So the politicians are like, we don't care. This is like, it's just drinking. So what's the difference if I take a few dollars here or there? It's just to let people drink. When Prohibition was repealed, those same corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials still had their hand out for the next bribe. So that's when they really, really started to infiltrate, starting with Prohibition, then moving forward out of the 30s and into the 40s. And then during the 40s, the United States government, naval intelligence, came to the mob and said, look, we've got U-boats circling up and down, patrolling up and down the eastern seaboard. We can't have this. There was a ship was burned. They wondered if it was Nazi sabotage, burned in the port of New York. So they went to the mob and said, look, you could please secure the coastline for us. You guys run the waterfront. And then because they did it so well, they guaranteed the government, they said we not only have the coastline locked down and the docks, but we also have all the fishing boats and cargo vessels coming in and out of the docks. Anything they spot, they'll immediately tell us, and we'll tell you. So they really, really helped during World War II, to the point that when we were going to invade Sicily, the Allies were planning the invasion of Sicily as a springboard to the continent. They did confer with American mobsters and said, hey, can you contact your cousins in Sicily? Let us know where the deep water ports are. Let us know how to move the equipment inland. So the mafia sort of like becomes kind of like more and more close with the American government. And at some point or another during the war, there's a prosecutor in New York who puts a tap on Frank Costello's phone. Frank Costello was a New York mafia don. He was an acting boss for Lucky Luciano, who went to prison. And Frank Costello gets a telephone call from a judge, and he says, hey, I want to thank you for that appointment that you got me. The guy was appointed recently to an appellate. He was appointed as an appellate judge. So Frank Costello, basically, he gets a phone call from a judge, and the judge says, hey, Frank, I really want to thank you for the appointment. And Frank Costello says, absolutely, anytime you need something from me, it's done. And he said, thanks. So the prosecutor listens to this, and he says, wow, I mean, the mafia don of New York is appointing judges. This is absurd. So he does a deep dive into Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was the political machine for many years that controlled New York, and he wants to know what's going on. Does anybody in Tammany Hall know about Frank Costello? So he goes to all the people, and he went to the boss of Tammany Hall, and the boss says, I don't even know who you're talking about. Well, it turns out that that guy was put in place by Frank Costello. So he's got all the people, and Costello realized that if you control different wards in New York, once you control enough of them, then you control the head of Tammany Hall because you put him in. And if you control the head of Tammany Hall, you control the mayor, you control the governor, because then you're going to put them in. So, and then if you control the mayor and the governor of New York, if they want to be a presidential candidate, so the mob had tremendous power, judges, politicians, to the extent that when Bobby Kennedy became Attorney General, he locked horns with J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI. And Hoover did not want to tackle the mob. He pretended the mob didn't exist for many, many years. And a lot of people tried to make the argument when I was reading different histories about him and biographies that the mob might have had pictures of him, photographs of him in compromising positions with his alleged lover, Clyde Tolson, who was the assistant director of the FBI. And I didn't believe any of that because I took a deep dive into Hoover's life. And I felt that Hoover always exaggerated the communist threat to America, whether he believed it or not. It was very over exaggerated now that we have hindsight. But if you were a communist or if you were an anti-war protester, if you threatened the institutions of the United States or national policy or international policy, Hoover went after you. But the mob never threatened the institutions of the United States. The mob liked operating within a capitalist democracy because it allows them to, capitalism is good, they want that, and for obvious reasons, and democracy is good for them because they get to control who goes into office by controlling the ballot boxes, by controlling the campaigns of elected officials, and being owed favors. So the mob was never a threat to the American institutions, and they had infiltrated to the degree where Hoover could not get them out, and he knew that. So he wondered why Bobby wanted to tackle them so ferociously, and Hoover's just dragging his feet. And Hoover knows that. He's got illegal eavesdropping devices all over the country. So he's listening to mafiosos say, this congressman's in my pocket, we put this mayor in, he owes us favors, this governor. And the mob was always nonpartisan. So they, in places like, for example, Louisiana, the mafia don in Louisiana would underwrite the campaigns of both governors in a gubernatorial race so that it didn't matter to him who won. They both owed him favors.
Which just seems like really good business practice. I read that and I was like, that's brilliant.
Well, that's basically what the corporations do today, too.
Yeah, that's right.
Is it? I figured that they were more aligned.
They're given to both sides, 100%.
Yeah. What they usually do is they lean, most corporations in recent past, they used to lean heavily right for the most part. Now a lot of corporations lean heavily left. However, they always make like a much smaller donation to the right, just in case. They want to make sure, I think, that they have sort of like everyone covered. But if you look at a chart, though, it is imbalanced where the mafia would always make sure it was completely balanced. They'd give both campaigns maybe 50 grand or 100 grand, which was a lot of money back then. You could run a race back then. Now it's in millions, right? But back then, and that was big money then. So, but they would definitely back both candidates. And Hoover's scratching his head going, what the hell is Bobby talking about? Like, does he expect me to surround the Capitol Rotunda and tell everyone to come out with their hands up? Like, this is ridiculous. Does he realize how high this goes? And would Bobby like a forensic accounting of his father, Joe Kennedy Sr.? And we'll see where the Kennedy money really comes from, because numerous witnesses testified to Joe Kennedy's involvement with bootleggers during Prohibition. And after Prohibition, the mob controlled the distribution of alcohol throughout the United States through their distribution companies, which Joe Kennedy still needed post-Prohibition. So he still works with the mob after. And then he's got a B-rate Hollywood company where he makes like B movies, and he needs the labor relations to be settled, and he keeps turning to the mob for his Hollywood company. So Joe Kennedy's totally in bed with the mob, which means the Kennedy money is tainted. It's corroded, that whole fortune. And so Hoover's trying to explain to Bobby through example and through so many warnings that, hey, and it's all in the book, Borgata.
And is Bobby, this is something I was trying to piece together when I was reading the book too. Is Bobby just trying to prove himself? Like he didn't get a chance to go to the war, so he just needs to make his, is he just trying to make a mark on the wall?
Yeah, it seems like it. He definitely walks away from everything with a chip on his shoulder. He missed the war. He was rejected at Harvard, which bothered him because the Kennedys usually went to Harvard. He's really, really walks around in life with a chip on his shoulder. He was the puny son, which he didn't like. Puny, quote unquote. That's not me saying that. That's what his own sister said. They worried that he was puny and quote unquote girlish. I read a book that was absolutely brilliant. I cite the book, and it's in the back. It was called gosh, it escapes me at the moment. It goes deep. It's by a woman who's an absolute genius, and she broke down the Kennedy psychologically broke down the Kennedy family. Kennedy psychosis is something it's called. It's in the back. Kennedy neurosis. It's in the back of my bibliography if you look it up.
It's referenced in the book too in the middle as well. There's some quotes.
Correct. Yeah. And she nailed it. I mean, she felt like the Kennedy men, thought of women as second-class citizens, as did the mob at the time. Another reason why the mob felt they were hypocrites. Bobby at one point was attacking the relationships in the mafia as incestuous. And meanwhile, the mob's going, the Kennedys trade women. The father gives the girlfriend to the son gives that same girlfriend to the other brother. This is like the next thing to incestuous, not far. So, they felt like a lot of hypocrisy existed within the Kennedy clan. And Bobby would call mafiosos girlish. You giggle like a little girl. And she pointed out that, and I pointed that out when she said that, this brilliant author, when she pointed that out, she didn't realize that Bobby was telling that to mobsters. And that's why he felt like that's an insult that would get their jugular vein, because it's something if you said to him would get his jugular vein. So they were very, very misogynistic, the Kennedys, and the mob felt like they were just hypocrites. You're a misogynist, and so are we. Okay, you're corrupt, and so are we. Your father was. Your money, your fortune is corrupt, so is ours. You're willing to look the other way when an investigation, when Bobby worked for the McClellan Committee, known as the Rackets Committee, anytime he came across, and when he was Attorney General as well, anytime he came across, there was a lead that led straight to his father, he would dead the lead, and he would be distraught for the rest of the day. He would be, quiet. They said it affected him. The people around him said he would just be like completely out of his wits. He couldn't get a hold of himself. It would go on for a few days, and it would take him time to recuperate from that, because he didn't want to believe that his own fortune was tainted. And also, too, I make the argument that the boys, Jack and Bobby, may not have known the extent of their father's relationship in the mob, because the mob was persuaded to back the Kennedys when Jack Kennedy ran for president. And the reason being why most of them bought in was because the mob had confronted other people like the Kennedys in the past. For example, when Thomas Dewey was a chief prosecutor in New York, he went after the mob like a crusader, and he put them all in prison, and he made a name for himself. And he then became governor of New York and forgot about the mob. He moved on, and then he ran for the Republican nomination for president, and the mob was way, way, way in his rearview mirror. He could care less about them. That same thing happened with Senator Estes Kefauver when he had the Kefauver Committee, where he dragged mobsters from around the country in front of Congress and subpoenaed them and tried to take a deep dive into the rackets they controlled and the illicit relationships they had with politicians. Once he exposed them, then he ran for the Democratic nomination for president, and he forgot the mob. He moved on. He wanted a national name for himself. He got it off the mob. So the mob was convinced that the Kennedy boys, Jack and Bobby, who both participated during the McClellan hearings, Bobby as chief counsel, Jack as a senator, and they felt that they were just making a name for themselves off their backs. And once they got into the White House, they would focus on more pressing issues like domestic issues like civil rights for African Americans, international issues like slowing down the nuclear arms race with the Soviets, keeping the Soviets behind the Iron Curtain. They started to poke their head out, not only in places like Berlin, but Southeast Asia as well, China. So they didn't want to. They figured the Kennedys will move on; they'll be done with us, and we'll have a clear path. We'll actually run free for 4 years, maybe 8. And they were promised that through not only Joe Kennedy Sr., but also Joe Kennedy's liaison to the mob, sort of like quote unquote, they called him an ambassador to the mob, Frank Sinatra, who had mafia friends and was very close friends with the Kennedys. He would visit the Kennedys in their whether it be in Hyannisport or Palm Beach. He was always very close with the Kennedys, and he was very close with mafia dons. He hung out with them in Vegas. He'd paint the town red with them, show them a great time. And the Calneva Lodge was somewhere where the mafia, Frank Sinatra and Joe Kennedy were invested. The Calneva Lodge was a place that was a sort of like hotel, casino, resort that sat on the border of California and Nevada. So there were gambling machines on the Nevada side, but you could just take in the sun and have a good time on the California side. So it was the Calneva Lodge, and Hoover had staked out the Calneva Lodge, had evidence that Joe Kennedy met with mobsters there. And he's wondering why Bobby wants to keep going after the mob. But at some point or another.
So I have a question here.
Yeah.
Because from the description in your book, Joe Kennedy, who's the patriarch of this family, is the one who calls the shots. He's the one that tells JFK that he's going to run. He's the one that is pulling all of the strings. He's figuring out how to get the funds. You're telling me that he can't tell Bobby to stop? Like, where does that fall apart?
You just asked another great question. Okay, so that, when they always felt like they could turn to Joe Kennedy if Bobby gets a little out of control. And within the first year of him being Attorney General, he musters all the forces under his command. He's got every agency's under Bobby. The Attorney General controls not only the FBI, but the IRS, Immigration and Naturalization Services, etc., INS, etc. And he's got them all on this massive crusade, like a blitzkrieg against the mob across the United States. And they're all on the run. He's trying to deport this one. He's trying to lock up that one. He's seizing the bank accounts of another one. And he's subpoenaing the wives, the daughters, and they want to kill him. They're starting to say, this is out of control. This was not what we got, what we were promised. And by the way, they dumped a ton of money into the West Virginia primary when Kennedy beat Hubert Humphrey, and they dumped a ton of money into Illinois when Kennedy pulled it out in Illinois against Nixon. So he definitely won with mob help. That said, always remember, the mob is nonpartisan. They also gave Nixon money. They also gave Lyndon Johnson money when he ran against Kennedy in the Democratic primary, Nixon when he ran against him in the general election. They had no problem either side. So why it's a great question is because they always felt like they could turn to Joe. And that, just as you said, Joe is in complete control of his sons. They look at him as like, almost like, not just like a patriarch in the old sense, but he's like, his word is law. Joe Kennedy is, if Joe Kennedy says this or that or the other thing, that is it. Don't, if he digs in, it's done. So the mob asked Sinatra, go talk to Joe. Tell Joe to get his little twerpy son. This is, how they felt at the time, not verbatim, but they made derogatory remarks in that vein towards Bobby. Tell him to get the stick out of his behind and stop coming after us. This is absurd. This is crazy. It's not what we got, not what we signed on for. And he's a hypocrite. His money's dirty too. So Sinatra's preparing to go speak to Joe Kennedy, who does a round of golf in Palm Beach, Florida, goes back, relaxes, gets a little dizzy, goes to the hospital, has a massive stroke. He's a complete invalid. He's just basically just sitting there in a wheelchair. So he's done. And Gore Vidal famously said, Gore Vidal, who was related to the Kennedys through marriage, I think, Gore Vidal famously said, had the mob been able to talk to Joe, he would have straightened out that beef in 2 minutes. In 2 minutes. He would have told Bobby, look, you're done. Go chase communists like J. Edgar Hoover wants you to. Go chase the southern right-wing white supremacists who are burning down churches. Just stay away from the mob. Whatever you want to do, that's fine. Stay away from the mob. But he's done. He's fried. So Sinatra takes a shot and says, I'll go to Bobby myself. I know him. I know the whole family. Let me go to him myself. So he goes to Frank Sinatra goes to Bobby, and Bobby's incensed with this intervention. How dare you come to me and ask me to back off? I'm the Attorney General of the United States, and you want me to back off? Now, have you? At the same time, there are a lot of mobsters who are scratching their head because they are working with the CIA to kill Fidel Castro. And it comes to Bobby's attention at some point. And he finds out that this one particular mobster, Johnny Roselli, is working hand in glove with the CIA to kill Castro. And Bobby not only doesn't back off, but he ramps up the investigation into Roselli, knowing that he's overseeing the same CIA, somehow overseeing it because he's the Attorney General, not directly, but somehow overseeing it, even if it's one removed. He's ramps up the investigation into Roselli. So he's like, are you kidding me? And Sam Giancana, another mafia boss. So that was where it went wrong. Joe has, by a twist of fate, Joe Kennedy is taken out of the picture. Frank Sinatra can't twist Bobby's arm. And not only that, Bobby goes to Jack after Frank Sinatra tries to intervene on behalf of the mob. And he tells Jack, you can't be friends with him anymore. He's got too many mafia friends. It's going to hurt your administration if this ever comes out. And Kennedy cancels Sinatra's upcoming invitation to the White House. And also Sinatra had just put in a helicopter pad in one of his homes to receive Marine One when Kennedy was going to visit him. And Kennedy canceled that too and went to Bing Crosby's house, which irritated Sinatra. These guys are egotistical entertainers too. So, he's like, okay, Bing Crosby won up to me with the president, and I look like a fool. So everybody hates Bobby. At some point, the mafia begins to make threats against the Kennedys. And Hoover, who's got these illegal eavesdropping devices. And before I get into the illegal eavesdropping devices, let me just explain Hoover and Bobby. So they lock horns over the mob. Hoover does not want to investigate them. But Bobby is planning to retire Hoover in Jack's second term. Now, Hoover's been there since Bobby was born. He's been there for decades. He's seen presidents come and go. He's never moved. I mean, if there is a dictator in the United States, it's J. Edgar Hoover, and he's got dirt on every president. The first time Hoover was almost ousted, he got through that by the hair on his behind, and because he was able to escape being ousted, he decided he was going to collect these dirty dossiers on politicians from now on and make sure that if anybody compromised him, he could respond, he could counter. And that's where all of the dirt that Hoover started to collect on public officials and politicians began. He didn't want to ever leave that office. So Bobby's threatening to retire Hoover in his second term, Jack's second term. And he goes one better. Bobby, when he worked for McCarthy, the McCarthy era, the McCarthy witch hunt, Bobby had worked there with Roy Cohn. And Bobby's sort of thing was to weed out homosexuals, gays within the United States government. Now that's like would strike us today as like the most psycho thing you could ever think of. But this is the 1960s. Gays weren't allowed to just walk around and say, yeah, I work for the government and I'm gay. This is the 1960s, and Hoover, who's the head of the FBI, and he's a lifelong bachelor. It's suspected that he vacations with his assistant director, who he pretty much catapulted from signing up for the bureau to the assistant director like overnight. And a lot of people suspect that they have a relationship. And this gets back to Hoover. So now Hoover, now you have to think about this. Hoover's not going to be outed as a gay in 2025. He's being outed as gay in 1960s America. It's institutionally and societally and societal unacceptable. So that would destroy his life and his career. Done with the FBI, smeared, done, finished. So Hoover now, to rewind, Hoover's getting through his eavesdropping devices across the country threats made by mobsters that they want to kill the Kennedys. And first they said, we want to kill Bobby, but then it quickly moved to Jack. And the reason why it became Jack was the mob felt, gee, if we kill Bobby, one mobster famously said, if you kill Bobby, Jack will send out the National Guard. We'll be done. If you kill Jack, then he's the head. And the head and the tail, Bobby's only the tail, the head and the tail will die together. You cut off the tail, the head still bites you. You have to cut off the head, the dog dies. So we have to go after Jack. So that's the mafia's reason why they begin to think of killing Jack. And now the reason why Hoover is ignoring all of these threats time and again, he's not approaching, by law, he's supposed to contact the Secret Service. He's supposed to take a walk up Pennsylvania Avenue and visit the Oval Office. He's supposed to tell the Attorney General. There's a lot of things that Hoover needs to do that he's not doing. And I question, I don't have the evidence to say this. I can't get inside J. Edgar Hoover's head, but I do ask this question to my reader, and I put it out there. Did he ignore these threats for want of them to succeed? And we have to always maybe wonder that, because it seems strange that the director of the FBI is not acting on any of them. So that's sort of like what's happening now. But it's not just Bobby Kennedy. The mob wants to kill Jack Kennedy rather to disempower Bobby. But also Jack now becomes hated by another segment of the population. So there's 3 people in the cabal to kill Kennedy. The CIA, certain members of the CIA, whether they were rogue agents or what have you. I don't have evidence that it was a decision from the top. John McCone was famously friendly with the Kennedys. I don't believe John McCone, who was the head of the CIA after Allen Dulles was removed. Dulles was the longtime, quote unquote, godfather of the CIA. The Kennedys ousted him. They got rid of him like they wanted to do to Hoover. And Hoover knew that, by the way, and knew if they got rid of Dulles, they could get rid of me. That was another reason why Hoover feared them. But they got rid of Dulles. He left under a black cloud. And basically, at this point, they want to, the CIA people rather want to get back Cuba, and they start to train Cuban exiles to take back the island. And these Cuban exiles who were originally trained in Guatemala but had camps in Miami, where Mafia Don Santo Traficante funded them, and Louisiana, where Mafia Don Carlos Marcello funded them. They say, okay, fine, we're going to invade the island. The CIA handlers say we're going to invade the island through the exiles, and we're going to back them up when they need us. And it became the famous debacle, the Bay of Pigs, in which these Cuban exiles, they hit the beaches, the Bahia Cochinas, it's called. They hit the beaches. They were told they were going to move inland, link up with the revolutionary force inland. Castro would be dead because the mob was going to kill him, and the U.S. would provide air support.
We've gotten through the story to the point that the Kennedys are in the White House. The patriarch of the Kennedy family, who has acknowledged ties with the mob, has no longer the mandate of heaven in the family because he's had a stroke. He's no longer able to go to his son that's chasing the mafia down all around the country and tell him to stop. And now there's this extra added layer where it seems like there's a rift developing in the government, where I was actually, so this is the place where I have some familiarity because I just finished reading David Talbot's book, The Devil's Chessboard. Did you come across that?
Yeah, it was very good. Mm-hmm.
And he kind of details this Bay of Pigs scenario from the Allen Dulles side. Mm-hmm. Because The Devil's Chessboard is basically a biography of Allen Dulles. And it makes the case that there's this other wing of the government that is wrestling for control with Kennedy. And so the Kennedys have started a war on 2 fronts. They've started a war with the mafia. They have this war going with the secret leadership of the CIA because the public director of the CIA is friendly with them, like you said. Mm-hmm. And now there's this additional layer where are now fighting on 3 fronts, which is with Hoover. And the Bay of Pigs is kind of at the center of this entire story. And so maybe we can just pick up with the Bay of Pigs.
Sure. So as you said, it's a multi-front battle that Bobby's having with everyone. It's in him to pick fights, and he's picking fights with everyone. And you have to pick and choose who you fight with. You need allies. Stalin famously said that when he was younger, I think he was in Siberia or something, and he had a fight, and some big guy was on top of him, and everyone else was just watching, and no one pulled him off. The guy, Stalin, was a little bit of a guy, and he said that I realized the importance of allies at that moment. And even though he purged millions of people and thousands within the Bolshevik Party, he always made sure that he had allies to go against the next enemy. So if it was Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, whoever he went after, he always made sure there was sort of like he would put together a strategic cabal against that person until he got rid of them. Bobby, on the other hand, just threw allies to the wind, and he just said, I'm going to pick fights with everybody. I'm Bobby Kennedy. My brother is the president. Might go back to the arrogance of growing up as a rich kid. Hoffa thought that he had that sort of like privileged rich kid attitude. But whatever the cause of it was, he did definitely feel that he didn't need anybody. Jack didn't need anybody, and we could pick fights with everybody. And he was. Now with the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban exiles, he picked fights with the CIA, number one, because the CIA now originally controlled at the time of the Bay of Pigs by Dulles. However, Dulles was out of town, Allen Dulles, when they launched the invasion. Dulles, I believed, kind of like made sure he was out of town, not knowing how Kennedy was going to react, because Kennedy swore that he would not support the troops. They needed to do this themselves. So Dulles felt that that when push came to shove, they could twist the president's arm and get the support that the exiles needed if it came time where they were stranded on the beach. So the exiles were promised Brigade 2506 was the Cuban exile trained brigade that was going to hit the beaches. They were promised by the CIA the support that they desperately would need in the event that Castro counterattacked, which he did. So they hit the beaches, and first of all, it was a debacle on the part of the CIA because they allowed the brigade, which was broken up into 3 sections of beach. They allowed them to hit the beaches in the dark, which is something we didn't even do during World War II. We, being the United States government, the United States military, did not do at Normandy, the Incheon landings in Korea. You need the light of dawn at least. People need to see the beachhead. They need to see where they're going. And yet this was pretty much a debacle. Another big problem was that they thought that the beach would be good terrain to drive inland from the coast. And because they were judging from things that had happened there in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, which was fought in Cuba, and they felt that they could basically they still could use that land. Well, the terrain had changed drastically since then, so it wasn't the same. So that they needed updated information they didn't have. So they send these.
It like turned into a swamp basically, right? So they couldn't
Yeah.
get through.
Yeah. So they hit the beach and they're trying to drive inland, and Castro's been waiting for them. The newspapers in South America, Latin America, and the United States have been talking about this imminent invasion. So Castro's like totally waiting for it. So as soon as it comes, Castro's little red army kind of goes in there and starts to push back the exiles and pins them down on the beach. And the exiles now are begging for support, air cover. Castro's got Soviet supplied MiG jets. And the Joint Chiefs, who was in charge after Dulles, General Charles Cabell, said, look, we need help. They need help. We can't leave them stranded. And Kennedy said, no, I'm not doing it. And they go, we cannot do this to them. We train them. We put this whole force together. We promised them. And he says, well, you shouldn't have. And they were livid with Kennedy.
Let's unpack that a little bit. So why didn't Kennedy want to support the rebel? Yeah, like why was he so bent on keeping the United States surface presence out of the scene?
Great question. So Kennedy basically, he was the new young generation, a new young generation of Americans, and Kennedy he wanted to change our sort of like appearance on the world stage. I don't believe that Kennedy wanted to be a warmonger, wanted to I mean, he did things obviously that he knew about with the CIA or toyed with them. The idea, he spoke to Tad Zolk, a journalist, one time about what do you feel about knocking off the heads of state in different countries, and Tad Zolk was like shocked that Kennedy even asked him that question. He said, "Are you kidding me? You can't. Let's not even discuss that." And he goes, "Oh no, I know. I was just throwing it around because I just wanted to think what you felt about it." But there may have been a degree, Kennedy may have been considering covert operations as opposed to overt, because Kennedy was a war hero. He was in World War II. I mean, he knows what death and destruction looks like. He saved members of his crew. Other members were killed in the South Pacific. So I think he was a patriotic American. He was very heroic, but I do think he wanted to make sure that we did not get into a nuclear war with the Russians, with the Soviets at the time. And he also was very concerned that we would look like bullies because Castro's this little tiny country off the coast of Florida, and we're this great big superpower. So I think Kennedy had.
There's also this element too where Castro didn't get killed as promised too. Like I wonder if it would have unfolded differently if they'd actually succeed. Can you talk a little bit about what went wrong with Castro's assassination?
Sure. Sam Giancana was the acting boss of the Chicago mob. Santo Trafficante was the boss of the Florida mob. And Johnny Roselli was a soldier who answered directly to Giancana in Chicago. People might argue that he was an LA gangster. He was also strong in Las Vegas. And that's all true. But his original home, you have to have somewhere when you're in the mob, you got to have somewhere where you hang your hat. He was originally a Chicago mobster who was loaned out to Los Angeles and then sent to Vegas as sort of like an envoy. So Roselli is at the forefront of the assassination plot to kill Castro with the CIA. And Giancana's his boss, so he's got to clear it with him. So Giancana becomes part of this. And then because the exiles are mostly based, the Cuban exiles they're going to be working with are mostly based in Florida, because we had a tremendous influx of Cuban immigrants into Florida after Castro started. He suspended elections. He was persecuting dissidents to his regime. And at that point, we had a wave of Cuban immigrants into Florida. So that's Santo Trafficante's territory. So and he also speaks fluent Spanish. Trafficante does. So and he was big in Cuba originally before any of the mobsters were there. Trafficante was there. So he says, okay, fine, let's bring in Trafficante, Roselli says. So they bring in Trafficante into the plot. So it's Giancana mostly, Roselli, and Trafficante. Well, Trafficante is trusted to basically pass off this. They're going to poison Castro, they decide. And he's supposed to get the poisons to people inside Cuba through the exile community. And they're supposed to work at doing it, but they find out later that Trafficante flushed the pills down the toilet. So he wasn't trying to kill Castro. Now, Giancana had his own reasons for working with the United States government. He wanted favors in return. Trafficante had reasons, which I'll speak of right now, presently, of why he didn't want to kill Castro. But Roselli was the only real patriotic American who expected nothing in return and really thought it was his patriotic duty to help the CIA kill Castro. So Roselli's on the up and up, and all CIA agents, many testified to that later in life, that Johnny Roselli was the difference. He was unlike the rest of them. He didn't even want money from us. And he at times took part. And this is a guy who frequents golf, marina yacht clubs and golf clubs, and he's swimming in the choppy seas off Cuba because his boat got nailed with a torpedo and during a sabotage mission. So he's really thinks this is his patriotic duty. So Trafficante, why does he not do it? Trafficante, when Castro took power, when he came down from the Sierra Maestra Mountains and marched into Havana, he threw out all the gangsters and he imprisoned any leftover ones. And he took over the casinos. And Trafficante was one of the ones who was imprisoned. And Trafficante didn't want to leave. He wanted his money. He had money buried all over the island. And it's all of a sudden he supposedly makes a deal with Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, to give him supposedly a pile of cash, one of his hidden piles of cash, in exchange for his release from prison so he could get out and go to the United States and get out of Cuba. And at one point he faced the firing squad. He was literally on the list. And so he gets out. So there's always been skepticism about his role in the affair later on with the CIA because he wasn't all into it. And it came out that people came out with the story that he didn't get out that easily. He got out by making a deal with Castro. That Castro, with his struggling economy, Castro had no idea how to balance an economy. I mean, he's a radical law student who basically seizes power at a very young age in Cuba, and now he's faced with the problems of some of the biggest countries. You still have to balance an economy, and you're doing it without United U.S. support, which Cuba always relied on. They always relied on selling the U.S. their sugar, their oil. They had oil refineries there, rather, and they had sugar plantations there and sugar refineries. So the United States always supported the Cuban government to some extent and always kind of controlled it. And now Castro wants to break away from the US. So he has that issue and he needs to balance the economy. And he supposedly made a deal, an underhanded deal with Trafficante to flood Miami with drugs. Because Trafficante means trafficker. It's the Italian word for trafficker. And Trafficante's father, who was also a mob boss, was a huge drug trafficker who used to go through Cuba to bring the drugs into the United States. And he also, during Prohibition, used the molasses in Cuba to make alcohol and bring it to the United States. So Trafficante had a long-standing relationship with Cubans. So now supposedly he makes a deal with Castro to continue the flow of narcotics into the United States through Miami as an entry point. And Trafficante rather works with Castro's G2 spies. They were like Soviet trained, sort of like KGB style a Cuban elite service called the G2 instead of the KGB or the CIA. It was the G2 in Cuba. So he's working with them, Trafficante, with Castro's guys, and he's also working with the exiles who hate Castro. So he's really got this really like incredible balancing act going on, Trafficante, and he's also bringing the drugs in supposedly with Castro because Castro needs to boost up his failing economy, and Trafficante is making a ton of money from it. While at the same time, he's kind of like telling the CIA, yeah, we're going to try to kill Castro. And what's interesting is that conversations that they had, Roselli and Giancana were very gregarious. They were very talkative. They were very transparent. And Trafficante always sat in the corner when they met with the CIA and was quiet and was reticent and didn't say too much. So it was like interesting that he was just taking it all in. So it's very, very possible, very likely he played a double role, and that's why Castro wasn't dead when the Bay of Pigs happened.
It seems shocking to me that the CIA would fail at something so big. Like, why did they even risk involving the mob to kill Castro in the first place? Why didn't they have their own agents do it?
I thought about that a lot, and what I feel is that the CIA at that time was very, very new at the art of murder. So the CIA comes out of basically it comes out of it was named something else during World War II, OSS something, and it morphed into the CIA. And there was issues with the CIA. Hoover didn't want a CIA. J. Edgar Hoover didn't want a competitive agency, even though it was international as opposed to domestic. He felt that it would be a competition for him. There were also there was a struggle with the CIA. What would they do? What would their mandate be? How much would they be allowed to do behind closed doors without the United States oversight or authority? So I feel at some point they were toying with the idea of using other people to kill, and then at some point they decided they were going to do it themselves, and that's eventually what happens later on. The CIA seems to, up until present day, I mean, there's evidence now that Mike Pompeo was talking about murdering Julian Assange. I do not believe that Mike Pompeo was going to hire a gang from the Crips or the Bloods or a mafioso from the Italian mob or a Russian rather, oligarch, mafia crew member. I think that I think they have people to do that now, whether it's ex-elite military or whatever it is. There's probably some type of sea change where after trying to do it with others who they couldn't depend on, I think at some point the CIA decided we'll do these hits ourselves. Don't forget they tried to kill quite a number of people around the same time. They tried to blow up Chou En-lai's plane Mao Zedong's right-hand man, Zhou Enlai. They tried to blow up his plane. They blew up the wrong plane, killed somebody else, killed another crew of people. They tried to kill Patrice Lumumba. They wanted to kill him. They were prepared to kill him through other people in the Congo. And then he was killed somehow without the CIA's help. But the CIA, I think, was trying to work with other rogues at this point in time in their history. And then at some point, I think that they were disenchanted with the ability of these other rogues, whether it be the mob or through people in Africa or what have you, to kill other people in Asia, that they decided they were going to do it themselves. And then maybe one day that might come out, their own sort of like Bourne Supremacy, Bourne Ultimatum, Jason Bourne series, that we're all familiar with, where they train people to kill. I think maybe that might come out one day. We'll see.
Because it does seem like a transitional strategy, right? Because prior to this, the CIA is funding guerrilla organizations in the countries themselves. Like, I don't think that they're bringing Guatemalan revolutionaries into the United States to train them in order to depose Jacobo Arbenz in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
They're basically just funneling money into the country, making sure that people have the funds that they need in order to overtake this socialist government that they don't like.
Correct.
And so if they're starting to actually train people in the United States as a stepwise tool to being able to narrow the scope of like who's involved or like how much control they have over the involvement, then all of a sudden it makes sense, right? Because if you're saying that maybe history will show that they decided to get their hands much more directly dirty, then this is like the last fingerprint before that disappears into the ether, where you're like, oh, interesting. They went from funding external organizations to funding domestic organizations to then just doing it themselves.
I believe so. I believe that's exactly right. There's some odd things. I mean, when there's an organization that was very, very instrumental in using ex-military. I don't know if I could say it, but using ex-military to go to, our foreign wars and fight. It's a corporation. They're trained in, these backlands, and then they end up.
This is just contractors? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably say I read a book, right? Let's just say I read a book about something called Blackwater.
Oh, I remember Blackwater.
Yeah, so Blackwater is basically these ex-military people who are paid to go into Afghanistan, Iraq, or wherever they are, and they're basically, it's a corporation, it's corporate. So, but they're ex-military. So you're using ex-military to kill. I mean, that's what they are ultimately doing. They may not be giving hits, they may not be contracts, they may not be whacking people. They're there to fight for freedom and democracy and liberty and all these great things.
Provide security, I believe, is the mandate.
Yeah, security. So yeah, but I mean, it's laughable if you. I read an excellent book on the organization that's like a big eye opener. And it's so we also have, there are forts as we speak right now. There are U.S. military installations in this country, forts, where 70, 80 people have been mysteriously murdered, and no one takes a deep dive into that. I mean, what? Yeah, hello.
Like, is it Fort Dix is one of the ones where there's problems?
Dix turned into a prison. I have friends that were in prison there, but there were a few other ones. It escapes me now, the main one, but there was 70 or 80 homicides. There was a guy who was reporting on it, and the story basically disappeared.
Whenever we talk about this stuff, I always tell Shiloh that we should have like a can of Coca-Cola that we can bring onto camera, and to remind people that we still play fair with American corporations and that we love America. But I always forget my can of Coca-Cola.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Wait, who are these people getting murdered? Sorry, I didn't follow.
Okay, so there's a bunch of. My cursory understanding of it is that there's some military base, which I can't remember the name of right now, where they had a bunch of unsolved murders, and they were like, is there a serial killer? Is there something weird that's happening at the base? A lot of them were suicides under suspicious circumstances. And
are these high-profile prisoners? They're international players?
No, they're actually members of the military, and I'm getting a little tired of all the whistleblowers who all commit suicide after they blow a whistle. that's like a little strange to me too. It makes you wonder. No evidence, obviously. Let me make that clear. I have no evidence that they're really not committing suicide. It's just strange that people whistleblow and then decide, we whistleblow usually on a big corporation or a government agency, and then decide to suddenly commit suicide. Um, so there was a great film on Netflix not too long ago about a journalist who just kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and he was supposedly committed suicide, but the hotel room where he was staying was a complete bloody mess.
Is this the Frank Olsen story?
I think it was. Oh no, Olsen was. That was the guy who jumped out of the window.
Jumped.
Yeah, jumped, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So it goes on and on. I do cite Operation Bluebird. I talk about it in the book Clash of Titans, Borgata, Clash of Titans. I talked about different CIA programs just to get you a feel of. They had a guy there by the name of Gottlieb. I speak about him in my book. Gottlieb was he was sort of like the Borgia of the CIA, he was known as. And basically, he was constantly trying to create new poisons that would kill people, and you wouldn't know that we killed them. It was supposed to not leave traces, not leave a footprint. And this guy Gottlieb was dirty as could be. He worked closely with Dulles. He was the one working on a toothpaste, I think, that they were going to try to get to Patrice Lumumba. They said, "Oh, he has such white teeth. He must brush his teeth a lot. Let's make him a toothpaste, and it'll kill him when he brushes his teeth." And it's like always mixed with stupidity too. When we look back at this, but this is what they were doing. They wanted to blow up. They wanted to make an explosive seashell because Castro was always diving, and we're going to make this beautiful, like really gorgeous seashell that Castro will have to see. And when he picks it up, it'll blow up in his face. And they were making the seashell, and I think at some point somebody's like, well, what happens if some kid dives and picks it up? That's like collateral damage. Hello, who cares? So they were really, really going out there. At the same time, they were using the mob to kill. And at some point, as I was saying earlier, I think at some point they decided, look, we can do it ourselves. Let's keep it in-house. It's like a company, a corporation, using outside resources, outside people. And then let's say I'm a general contractor and I keep using all these other companies that keep failing me. At some point, I'm going to say, why don't I just train my own workers to do it themselves? I know how to run my own company. So if you look at it that way, I think that's what happened at some point. Kennedy, during Kennedy's time, Diem of Vietnam was killed. Again, it was a CIA-backed coup that killed him. Also, too, Trujillo of the Dominican Republic was killed during Kennedy's time. It was a CIA-backed coup that killed Trujillo, Rafael Trujillo. So, these are people who are getting killed, and the CIA is always behind it. Did they kill them? No, but they supplied the guns. They gave them the gas for the car. They told them, don't worry, we got you back. And then the guy gets killed. We didn't do it, but, somebody else did it. And I think that's the stance they wanted to take if the mob was able to kill Castro. Hey, we gave him the poison. We made the poison back at CIA headquarters, but we didn't really drop it in the drink. That's the mob that did that. They always wanted sort of a degree of separation, I think, so that they could have some type of plausible deniability. And at some point, I think that they decided, let's keep these things in-house. I'm sure when Mike Pompeo made the remark that he was thinking about killing Julian Assange, I'm sure they weren't going to use outside sources. Yeah.
Okay, so we have everything going wrong at the Bay of Pigs, famously. We have Jack Kennedy refusing to get involved in an official capacity and give the air support that would be necessary to actually make this invasion successful. We started talking about Bobby and Hoover a little bit. What's going on the FBI front as things are disintegrating between the CIA and Kennedy relations?
So the distance between Hoover and Bobby continues. There's no middle ground with Bobby. I believe Hoover was a compromising man. I believe Hoover knew that this is the way the United States government operates. I believe in the United States government. I am a patriotic American, and I want the best for our country. But these are certain things that you cannot tangle with. The mob has infiltrated politics. They have infiltrated law enforcement. One assistant director famously said, Hoover knew that if we lock them up too, we have some government attorney that some are great, some aren't, and fighting against the highest paid lawyer that the mob could afford, fighting possibly against a bribed jury, a bribed judge. we're not going to show up well. We're going to lose. And the FBI is going to look like a bunch of losers. And we don't want that. It's easier to kind of pinch Bonnie and Clyde, gun down John Dillinger, we Pretty Boy Floyd. Let's focus on these like lone bank robbers who just like have nobody but themselves. You gun them down. There's nothing else to worry about. It's not an organization, and we could really get the headlines. Put machine guns in our hands. Look like we just, Hoover and Tulsa never fired guns. They'd pose with machine guns, and to look like, well, the FBI's got our back. This is great. John Dillinger can't rob banks in America. Yay! While the mob runs wild. So I think that sort of was Hoover's stance, and it infuriated Bobby. Now with the Bay of Pigs, when Kennedy blows it at the Bay of Pigs, he's pissed as could be at the CIA, and he threatens to scatter it into 1 million pieces. And they basically tell Dulles, look, you could resign, but you only have so many months to do it, and then you're out. You're going. And Dulles is like beside himself. Dulles's brother was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. Dulles is a CIA director, and Dulles' family is an old American, rich, very wealthy family that produced other secretaries of state in the past. This is blue-blooded American, aristocracy. And you got these parvenus bossing me around now, destroying my life. This is like ridiculous to me, this Dulles' attitude, in my own words. So Dulles is like thrown to the side.
Is parvenu just like a newcomer? I haven't heard that term before.
Parvenu is like new money, I think. Like to the Dulles family, the Kennedys are kind of new money. Joe Kennedy made the fortune, Bobby Kennedy's first generation, Jack. This is like these guys are new on the block. Forgive me if most of my vocabulary, I don't get to talk to PhDs often. So, and I was in jail when I read most of my books. So 90% of my vocabulary, I didn't even know how to pronounce when I started using the words.
That's awesome. I'm going to take that word to the bank. Yeah.
I
love learning new words.
I'd never heard that word before.
Yeah,
that was genuine interest. I think
I was going to look it up later.
Or something. I could be completely wrong. But
no. I think that I think it sounds French, and so it's probably like parvenu sounds like somebody who's like along they came kind of thing. Like it makes sense, but I just like it's a beautiful word. I hadn't heard it before. I didn't mean to interrupt your flow.
No, it's exactly right. So they're new on the block. Along they came. Here they are, and now they're in the White House. And now we don't really care if your family goes back generations. You're taking orders from us. So Dulles is done, and filled with ego. Dulles is.
By the way, like before we move past that, what was the conflict between Jack and Dulles? Where did that stem from?
Jack didn't have a serious conflict with Dulles until the Bay of Pigs, because he felt that the CIA betrayed him by telling him that this is going to be like a cakewalk and we'll have no problem, don't sweat it. Now, having said that, when Jack was first elected president, he had some friends down in they might have been in Hyannisport or Palm Beach, and they were kind of hanging out by the water. And they go, "What are you going to do, Jack? Who are you going to get rid of first?" And somebody said, "Axe Hoover, get rid of him." And another guy goes, "No, axe Dulles first." And then Kennedy felt like at that point, in the very beginning of his term, I think we should leave them both in place because, we just kind of pulled this election. It was very narrow. It's not a mandate to rule. And I got to keep some of the old guard in there. Let's leave them where they are. Let's not look like we're overturning the country and, the administration in Washington. So he left them in place. And then after the Bay of Pigs, he felt like Dulles lied to him, and the CIA lied to him by leading him to believe that these exiles, these Cuban brigade is going to no problem overthrow Castro's regime, march on to Havana, and give us a phone call when they get there. And it just didn't happen. So he's literally beside himself with hatred for Dulles, and he feels like Dulles made him look like an idiot because Kennedy took the blame. He said, "Look, the buck stops here. I'm the president," because it was a debacle. We all knew it was after. And he goes, "It's my fault," but in private. So he takes full blame in public, but in private he goes.
How pissed was the country at the time? Like, how much of a public affairs nightmare was the Bay of Pigs? Like, I obviously didn't live through it, so it's hard for me to understand.
Yeah, it was pretty bad. I mean, we knew America's hand was behind it. Everybody knew. So that's why they were a little mad at Kennedy, too, because they're like, Jack, you're not hiding our hand. So the first planes that took off, this was the plan. They had these old American bombers that they repainted with Cuban uh, sort of emblems to make them look like Cuban planes. And they bombed they did a first run against Castro's Air Force, and they beat up some planes on the ground, while one supposedly came and flew to Miami, to Florida, and pretended that we all defected. And on the way out, those guys bombed Castro's planes, but I happened to just fly straight here, and nobody believed it. Everybody was like laughing, going, "What? Give me a break. The plane he landed in is a US plane with some Cuban emblems. It's us. We did this." And those guys didn't defect. We sent them. So Kennedy now feels like he's the laughing stock, and he's like, forget there's going to be no airstrike. Forget Don and the MiGs. They go, we didn't get the MiGs. We got a couple of trashy planes on the ground, those guys. We really need to knock out his Air Force still, or they're going to get strafed on the beach. And Kennedy's like, no, I'm not going to reveal my hand in this. This is supposed to be, you guys told me you could do it yourselves. And literally, like, the biggest people in government, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are going, Jack, you gotta bend. And so he won't bend. So this is like known as a debacle. So he has now a second bite of the apple. At some point or another, John McCone comes to Kennedy and he said, look, I have information that there's, and I have also too, I could show you the aerial photographs. There's missiles off the coast of Florida in Cuba, Soviet missiles, nuclear warheads. We got a problem. 90 miles off the coast of Florida, you got nuclear warheads facing America. Not only can they reach Florida, but they could, like, Washington is like a minute away, and they could literally go all the way to the top of Canada and California. There's a picture in my book, in Borgata Clash of Titans, where I show the range of those missiles, and it covers the entire United States. So now you only have like seconds to react if they fire them from Cuba. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff tell Kennedy, here's your excuse. You wanted to hide America's hand in the Bay of Pigs. We understand it. We wanted it to look like it was just an exile force that took it upon themselves to get back their homeland. But now, the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, worked with Fidel Castro to put these nuclear warheads here. We have every right to invade the island. This is a national security issue. Let's go. And he goes, no. And they go, whoa, Jack, you got to be kidding me. Here's our excuse. We won't look like the imperialist mercenaries Castro is always saying we are. We'll be the heroes of our own hemisphere, getting these nuclear warheads that are facing, we protect our hemisphere. We've got to get them out. It's bad enough we look like we haven't been protecting it with Castro, but now we can't allow these things to exist. Kennedy goes, no, I don't want to invade the island. So now even hawks in Kennedy's administration, really not hawks. That's when the term kind of came about, the hawks and doves, but they weren't hawks. They were basically just guys saying, look, Jack, I get the whole Camelot, thing, and, you're known as a peace guy, and the new wave of Americans and the new generation is here, but these guys are off the coast. There's nuclear warheads. We got every right to go in. Send in the Marines. So the Cubans are like waiting in Florida, with bated breath, going, we're going to get our homeland back. The beard blew it. The guy who bangs on speakers with his shoe, that nut job in Russia, finally partnered with this crazy screaming lunatic in our homeland, and they blew it. They made the biggest debacle they could make. They tried to put missiles, point them at a superpower. We're getting our homeland back. And they're like really convinced that this is it. We may have lost the Bay of Pigs, but we're getting our homeland back now. The US Marines are going in. So Bobby is against it. Bobby goes, I don't want to invade either. Goes, we'll look, it'll put a black mark, he said, on the United States forever. And we can't do that, he said. It's like gonna make us look like bullies again. He starts with that. And they go, no. The other guys are going, no, you gotta invade. And they're going back and forth. And the other option that developed out of the conversations that they had was that they could quarantine the island, keep any Soviet ships from going into the island and bringing more missiles, and then try to do some back channel communications with Khrushchev to either have him disarm the missiles, or Kennedy wanted to make a quid pro quo. He made a deal on the side. So Kennedy decides to quarantine the island, and the Navy's literally like surrounding Cuba, making sure that any submarines or battleships or cargo ships can't get in or out. And at the same time, basically, they're still pushing Kennedy to invade, but Kennedy's going, I'm going to go with the quarantine. And he makes this back channel communication with Khrushchev, and he says to Khrushchev, look, Khrushchev says there are American missiles in Turkey, pointing at the Soviet Union. You disarm those, I'll disarm the missiles in Cuba. So Kennedy makes this side deal with Khrushchev to disarm the missiles in Turkey, and NATO's livid. NATO, NATO's like, yeah, you're over there. We're on the front line over here. You see how these Russians fight. They overran Germany. Like once they got their thing up, they had no problem overrunning Germany and the rest of Eastern Europe. And, they threw up an iron curtain. We're going to have to face them. You can't take those missiles out. So NATO is livid. They're like literally de Gaulle, I think Macmillan or whoever's in charge of the Prime Minister of England's like, first their initial response was, go, we got you back. NATO wanted him to go in too. So now he says to Khrushchev, I'm going to disarm the missiles in Turkey. This is a side deal that didn't come out for 25 years, by the way. And then he makes a promise to never invade Cuba again and to leave it alone. So now the Cuban exiles just lost their homeland, and they're furious. There's 200,000 Cuban immigrants in Florida, and there's CIA-trained militant exiles, some of whom were former military, most of whom weren't. But these guys are ready to roll, and they despise Kennedy now. And we've been telling the world now, since they were thrown out of Cuba, that they're the mascots of liberty, the mascots of democracy. And now they become targets of the Kennedy administration because he says, if you even continue to train, I'm ordering my Justice Department to lock you up. So now Bobby's got a mandate from the president to tell the FBI to lock up the Cuban exiles in places like British-run Bahamas, wherever the Cuban exiles are still training. Any sabotage missions, they're being pulled over at sea by U.S. Coast Guard ships and being locked up. So they're like, wait a second, the president that we thought was going to get us back our homeland not only blew it twice, but now he's locking us up. So now the Cubans are beside themselves.
Why does Kennedy go that extra mile to make that promise? Is he really just trying to apologize for the Bay of Pigs still, or like what's going on?
We can't tell what's on Kennedy's mind. The people who advocate for Kennedy, the historians who feel that he made the right decision, will use the argument that he was avoiding a nuclear holocaust, that he felt that if I make a move and try to get the missiles out of Cuba, Khrushchev could launch missiles, or maybe make a move in East and West Berlin, or Southeast Asia, other places where things were tenuous, things were not so. So the argument in favor of Kennedy's decision was, I'm terrified of a nuclear war. And I will give Kennedy that. There is part of me that does trust that he felt that way, and he did want to avoid a nuclear holocaust. Kennedy was a very sensitive man, unlike Bobby. I walked away with a tremendous hatred for Bobby Kennedy with all of my research that I had done, but a tremendous liking for Jack Kennedy as a person. People will hear this and go, well, he was a horrible philanderer. He fooled around with millions of women. That aside, I come from a mob world where every mob don, every mob capo, every mobster had a gumata, girlfriend on the side. So if you could get past that, as a person, he was definitely a how to make friends and influence people type of guy, where Bobby was how to make enemies and destroy their lives type of guy. And Jack, was Joe Kennedy famously said, Jack's easygoing. Bobby, he says he's like me. He hates like me, and he holds grudges like me. And on another occasion, he said, if Bobby was in Nazi Germany, he would have made an excellent Nazi, and he would have been really sincere about it. He would have loved being a Gestapo. This is his father talking. This isn't like, somebody else who met him once and had a little bit fight with him. This is his own father judging him as a Nazi. So I had a tremendous difference in my opinions of Bobby and Jack. So I do believe that Jack's intentions were coming from the right place. But he was also he would be attacked by his opposition as being easy on communism, soft on communists, in bed with the Russians, a friend of Khrushchev. And the CIA was even concerned because all of these back channel communications. Now, Kennedy wants to open up other issues and try to slow down the nuclear arms race. So he's going back and forth with Khrushchev, but without the CIA's sort of approval of the letters and the communication. And the CIA feels like, okay, you want to communicate with Khrushchev, but not without approval. We really don't like a young president who's inexperienced having this love affair with a red czar. This is a little bit of a problem for us. And we don't trust the communication if we're not able to oversee it and edit it maybe before it goes back and forth. So the CIA kind of like, was Kennedy unpatriotic? To them, yes. To me, no. I think Kennedy's intentions were always good. I got to tell you, I walked away loving John F. Kennedy, even with the stupid stuff that he may have did, and I disagree with. I think he should have went in during the missile crisis. I think Castro would have ate it up. I mean, Castro would have been mad but couldn't have done anything about it. But I think Khrushchev would have ate it up. I think he would have sucked it up. He was trying to push Kennedy into a corner, see how much he could get away with because of the Bay of Pigs. So, one mistake leads to another. The argument today is if the withdrawal in Afghanistan wasn't done so horribly, maybe Putin wouldn't have been so emboldened. It's an argument. You have bullies on the world stage that react to things just like the bully on the street corner or the bully in the mob. This is human nature. We can't escape it. Human nature is constant. I don't care what position you have in this world. If you're the head of a company or you're the head of a nation, it's human nature. So people push. Well, I think the Bay of Pigs led to the missile crisis. The missile crisis leads to a fallout between Kennedy and the exiles. So the Cuban exile community walks away from the now missile crisis, which followed the Bay of Pigs, with a tremendous hatred of John Kennedy. And they despise him. And the exiles, the militant exiles who were trained by CIA and their CIA handlers, the CIA handlers are making comments that Kennedy's inaction twice now was tantamount to treason. So now you have the exiles now and their CIA handlers who are already working with the mafia, drawing closer to the mafia, who also hates the Kennedys. So now you have the mob hating the Kennedys, you have the Cuban exiles hating the Kennedys, and you have the CIA handlers who feel that Kennedy dropped the ball twice, hating Kennedy and feeling that his inaction is tantamount to treason. And those are the three major players in the cabal to kill John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, so we've reached the
denouement.
Yeah, the central drama.